Dust, thick as ground bone, coated the Montana Trail and clung to Elara Vance's worn boots like regret. Ahead, the silhouette of the rocking our ranch house hunched against a vast, unforgiving sky, smoke whispering from its chimney a thin promise against the twilight chill. Inside, she knew, weighted a burden heavier than her own worn valise. 6 motherless children, and a man whose grief was a fortress. She'd come to cook, hired sight unseen for a pittance and a roof. But the emptiness echoing inside her, the hollow carved by fever taking her own child and husband within a year, recognized a hollow in this place. She tightened her grip on the valise, the cool brass of the locket beneath her blouse a familiar, painful weight. This was no sanctuary. It was a last chance. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I got something extra special saved just for you. The buckboard that brought her rattled away, swallowed by the gathering dusk. Silence rushed in, profound and unsettling after the journey. Only the wind spoke, sighing to the pines flanking the long valley, carrying the scent of cold earth and distant snowmelt. Elara stood alone on the hard-packed earth before the porch. The house, whether gray timber bleached by sun and scoured by wind, seemed to watch her with weary eyes. Shutters hung slightly askew, paint peeled like sunburnt skin. A lone oil lamp glowed weakly in a window, casting long, trembling shadows. The door creaked open before she could knock. A man filled the frame, broad shoulders silhouetted against the lamplight. Silas Reed. His face was all angles and shadows, etched deep by sun and something harder. His eyes, a faded denim blue, swept over her without warmth, lingering on the valise, then her face, assessing. No greeting, just a curt nod, a jerk of his head inward. "Kitchen's through there," he said, his voice rough and used. "Stove's lit. Children need feeding." He stepped aside, revealing a glimpse of the room beyond, a parlor dominated by a massive stone hearth, cold and dark now, and shapes huddled on a worn settee. Eyes, wide, watchful eyes reflecting the lamplight. 6 pairs. Then he was gone, his heavy boots thudding toward the back of the house, leaving the scent of leather, horse, and loneliness. Elara stepped into the dimness. The air inside was thick with the smell of wood smoke, stale biscuits, and unwashed wool. Dust motes danced in the single lamp's beam. The shapes on the settee resolved. Children, ranging from a girl barely past toddlerhood clutching a ragged cloth doll, to a boy near manhood staring at her with open hostility, arms crossed. 2 girls, maybe 10 and 8, pressed close together, identical in their wariness. A smaller boy, perhaps 6, hid behind the eldest boy's legs. Another girl, around 12, sat slightly apart, her gaze fixed on the cold hearth, fingers worrying a faded blue ribbon tied around her wrist. No one spoke. The silence was a wall. Elara set her valise down near the door. Her own grief, a familiar ache beneath her ribs, tightened. She recognized the guardedness, the raw edges of loss mirrored in their small faces. She forced her spine straight. She was here to work. "I'm Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice softer than she intended in the heavy quiet. "I'll get supper started." She moved toward the doorway Silas had indicated, feeling the weight of their stares like physical pressure. The kitchen was a realm of shadows and lingering neglect. A large cast-iron stove dominated one wall, its firebox glowing dully. Shelves held sparse, mismatched crockery. A worn pine table stood in the center, scarred and sticky in patches. The smell of burnt flour and something vaguely sour, milk left too long, hung in the air. A single lantern on the shelf above the dry sink offered meager light. Elara took a slow breath, the scent of neglect pricking at her resolve. She shrugged off her shawl, hanging it on a peg, the movement deliberate, grounding. She found flour, coarse and grayish, in a sack under the sink, lard in a cracked crock, a few withered potatoes in a basket, dried beans. Not much. She filled a kettle from a water bucket by the door, the metal handle cold against her palm. The rhythmic clang as she set it heavily on the stove broke the oppressive silence. She sensed movement in the doorway. The eldest boy, lean and taut as a bowstring, leaned against a frame, watching her every move. The hostile one, Thomas, she recalled from Silas's sparse letter. "Pa says you won't stay," he stated, his voice challenging. Others didn't. Elara didn't look up, focusing on measuring flour into a chip bowl. The locket felt suddenly cold against her skin. "I was hired to cook," she replied evenly. "I aim to do that." She added a pinch of precious salt she brought, feeling the grit of the flour beneath her fingertips. He snorted, a harsh sound in the quiet kitchen. Ma knew how to cook proper. The words hung, sharp and deliberate. Elara felt them like a physical sting. She saw, suddenly, not the defiant boy, but the grief twisting beneath the bravado. Her own throat tightened. She remembered small hands clutching hers, fever hot, the terrible stillness afterward. She poured water slowly, mixing the dough with stiff fingers. "I imagine she did," she said finally, her voice low. "This won't be like hers, but it'll be hot and filling." He didn't reply, just pushed off the doorframe and vanished back into the gloom of the parlor. Elara exhaled, the sound shaky. She kneaded the dough, the repetitive motion, a small anchor. One step, then the next. The beans needed soaking, but there was no time. She boiled them hard and fast. She peeled the potatoes, the knife scraping rhythmically, her thoughts adrift, the cool brass of the locket, a tiny braided lock of hair inside. William, my sunshine, gone. The silence of her own empty cabin, the wind screaming down the chimney. This silence was different. It was waiting. Movement again, smaller this time. The youngest girl, the one with the doll, stood in the doorway, her thumb in her mouth. She stared at Elara with enormous, solemn eyes. Elara offered a tentative smile. The girl didn't smile back, just watched, unblinking, as Elara shaped the dough into rough biscuits. The smell of cooking began to permeate the kitchen, pushing back the sourness, the earthy scent of potatoes boiling, the warm, plain smell of baking bread. It drew the others. Slowly, silently, the children drifted to the table. The wary sisters sat together. The smaller boy, Ben, perched on the edge of his chair, eyes darting between Elara and the stove. The quiet girl with a ribbon, Martha, sat staring at her hands. Thomas slouched at the far end, radiating skepticism. Only the eldest girl, Sarah, who'd been staring at the hearth, remained in the parlor doorway, a silent observer. Silas reappeared, filling the kitchen doorway much as his son had earlier. He washed his hands roughly at the dry sink, splashing water onto the floorboards. He didn't look at Elara, just took his place at the head of the table. His presence a heavy stone dropped into the room. His gaze swept over the meager preparations, the pot of bubbling beans and potatoes, the biscuits browning unevenly in the oven, the single lantern's light pooling on the worn wood. Elara dished the stew into chip bowls, the steam warming her face. She placed a biscuit beside each bowl. The portions were small, unadorned. She set the last bowl before Silas. He picked up a spoon, the scrape loud in the quiet. The children followed suit, a hesitant chorus of spoons against crockery. No one spoke. The only sounds were chewing, the crackle of the fire in the stove, the wind finding cracks around the window frame. Elara stood back, near the stove, feeling like an intruder. She watched the small, solemn faces bend over their food. Ben ate quickly, eyes wide. The younger sisters picked at their beans. Martha broke her biscuit into tiny pieces, eating none. Thomas ate methodically, his eyes downcast. Sarah remained in the doorway, untouched bowl before her on the table, her gaze fixed on the flickering shadows on the wall. Silas finished first. He pushed his bowl away, the sound abrupt. He didn't look at Elara. "Children to bed," he said, his voice gruff. Sunup comes early. The scrape of chairs, murmured goodnights, directed at their father, not her. Thomas herded the younger ones towards the stairs, a reluctant shepherd. Martha followed, still worrying her ribbon. Sarah finally moved, picking up her untouched bowl and carrying it silently to the dry sink before disappearing upstairs. Ben lingered, looking for his father's retreating back to Elara. He took a step towards her, his small face pale in the lamplight. Silas paused in the doorway to the parlor, a dark silhouette. He didn't turn, but his stillness was absolute, listening. The boy's eyes, wide and uncertain, locked onto Elara's. He opened his mouth, closed it, then whispered, the sound barely audible over the wind sigh outside and the stove's low rumble. You gonna be here tomorrow? Elara's breath caught. She saw the raw need in his eyes, the echo of her own hollow place. Before she could form an answer, Silas's voice cut through the tension, flat and final, aimed at the boy but hanging heavy in the air between them all. Bed. Now. The boy flinched, scurried past his father, and vanished up the stairs. Silas remained in the doorway for a moment longer, a brooding presence. Then, without a word or glance at Elara, he turned and walked into the dark parlor, leaving her alone with the dirty dishes, the cooling stove, and the deafening silence punctuated only by the locket's cold touch against her skin and the echo of that small, hopeful voice. You gonna be here tomorrow? The question hung, unanswered, a fragile thread in the vast Montana night. The wind mourned around the eaves all night, a counterpoint to the silence inside the rocking R. Elara Vance lay rigid on the narrow cot in the small, cold room off the kitchen, the brass locket pressed like a brand against her chest. Ben's whispered question, "You gonna be here tomorrow?" echoed louder than the gale. Silas's interruption had been a wall slammed down. Yet, in the pre-dawn gray seeping through the single window, she rose. The hollow place inside her, carved by William's fevered gasps and the crushing silence of her own empty cabin, recognized the hollow here. She dressed swiftly, fingers numb with cold, her decision a quiet ember in the gloom. One day, then the next, she would cook. The kitchen was colder than the night before, the stove's iron belly dark and empty. She laid kindling, struck a match. The flare momentarily illuminated the starkness. The worn floorboards, the chipped crockery stacked haphazardly, the pervasive smell of dust and lingering sourness. As the fire caught, crackling defiance into the chill, she sensed movement. Silas stood in the doorway, already clad in his worn work coat, hat pulled low. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge her beyond a flicker of his gaze towards the growing flames. He filled a tin cup from the water bucket, drank deeply, the sound harsh and quiet, then turned and vanished out the back door into the lingering dark. His silence was its own answer to Ben's question. Tolerance, not welcome. Breakfast was porridge, thick and plain, made from the coarse gray flour. The children descended like wary shadows. Thomas avoided her eyes, slouching into his seat. Sarah drifted in last, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the walls, untouched by the growing warmth from the stove. Martha sat quietly, her faded blue ribbon wound tightly around one finger. The two younger sisters, Emma, 10, with watchful eyes, and Clara, 8, clinging to her side, watched Elara's every move. Ben's eyes, though, sought hers, a flicker of something tentative, hopeful, before darting away as Thomas nudged him. Elara served the food, the scrape of spoons the only conversation. Silas returned briefly, ate standing near the door, his presence a weight that flattened the room, then left again without a word. The rhythm of the day asserted itself. Elara scrubbed the sticky table, the smell of lye soap battling the ingrained sense of neglect. She tackled the dry sink, grimacing at the grime. She found a basket of mending, shirts with frayed collars, dresses with torn hems, small socks worn thin. She settled near the stove, the rhythmic pull of needle through cloth a familiar, grounding ritual. She felt eyes on her. Clara, the younger sister, had crept closer, drawn by the quiet activity. She watched silent, clutching a rag doll missing an arm. Elara held up a small shirt. "This bend," she asked softly. Clara nodded, a quick, bird-like movement. "Torn right at the elbow," Elara murmured, more to herself. "Always the elbows." A memory flashed, sharp and sudden. William, tumbling in the yard, tearing his favorite shirt, his wail turning into giggles as she scooped him up. The locket felt leaden. She blinked, forcing the image away, focusing on the stitch. Clara inched closer, her small finger tentatively touching the patched fabric on Elara's own sleeve. Midday brought the storm. The wind, previously a lament, turned furious, screaming down from the pine-clad ridges. Rain lashed the windows like thrown gravel. Silas burst in, water streaming from his hat brim, his face grim. "North fence line," he bit out, the words directed at Thomas, who had appeared tense in the parlor doorway. "Tree down. Big one. Took a whole section. Cattle could scatter." His eyes flickered past Thomas, landing briefly on Elara. "Need all hands." It wasn't a request. It was necessity. Chaos erupted. Thomas grabbed oilskins, thrusting smaller ones at Emma and Clara. Sarah moved with unsettling slowness, pulling on a worn coat. Ben looked terrified by the storm's fury. Martha stood frozen, clutching her ribbon. Elara's mind raced. "Ben, Martha," she said, her voice cutting to the dim lanterns. "Find every lamp, fill them with oil, check the wicks." She turned to the older girls. "Emma, Clara, blankets. Dry ones. As many as you can carry to the back porch." She snatched her own shawl. "Sarah, hot water. Big kettle. Now." The orders, born of frontier survival instinct, snapped the paralysis. Ben scrambled towards a cupboard where lamps were stored. Martha, after a startled glance at Elara, followed him. Emma and Clara darted towards the stairs. Sarah, for the first time, looked directly at Elara, a flicker of surprise in her detached eyes, before moving to the stove. Out in the maelstrom, the scene was bleak. Rain slanted horizontally, stinging exposed skin. A massive pine had shattered a 30-foot section of fence, scattering splintered wood. Silas and Thomas were already wrestling with the downed trunk, muscles straining against the weight and the sucking mud. Elara and the older girls brought armfuls of dry blankets to the meager shelter of the back porch. Sarah followed with the heavy kettle of steaming water. "Set it here." Elara shouted over the wind. "Emma, Clara, hold these blankets up. Make a wall." They obeyed, small hands trembling as they stretched the woolen fabric against the porch posts, creating a fragile windbreak. Elara grabbed an axe Silas had abandoned, her skirts heavy with mud, and began hacking at the smaller branches snarling the trunk. Her hands, roughened by work but unused to this, blistered quickly. She ignored the pain, the cold bite of rain, the wind that screamed like a banshee. This was survival. This was belonging, forged in mud and necessity. A rider materialized through the downpour, pulling a lathered horse to a stop near the porch. Old Man Dobbs, a neighbor from a distant spread, his face etched with concern beneath his dripping hat. Silas heard the crack. Bad. His eyes scanned the frantic activity, lingering on Elara, axe in hand, her hair plastered to her face, directing the girls holding the blankets. "Got your hands full, I see." His gaze shifted meaningfully back to Elara. "New help stickin', Silas? Mighty handy having a woman's touch about the place again." His tone was meant as friendly, but the words landed like stones. Silas, straining against the trunk, froze for a split second. Thomas shot Dobbs a venomous look. Elara felt the heat rise in her cheeks, unrelated to exertion. The locket seemed to burn cold against the skin, a reminder of the role she couldn't replace. "Fence needs mendin', Dobbs," Silas grunted, his voice tight, dismissing the comment. "Grab that, Peavy." Dobbs dismounted, joining the fray, but the awkwardness lingered like the chill. It took brutal, sodden hours. Elara fetched tools, held timbers steady while Silas and Dobbs hammered, wiped mud from Thomas's eyes when his hands were full, passed dippers of tepid water. Ben and Martha, faces pale but determined, kept the lanterns burning on the porch as twilight bled into the storm dark. Slowly, a rough patchwork fence rose, a scar across the damaged line. When the last nail was driven, Silas straightened, wiping rain and mud from his face with a sodden sleeve. His eyes met Elara's across the wreckage. He gave a single, curt nod. It wasn't warmth. It was acknowledgement. A bare fraction of the weight in the room lifted. Back in the kitchen, soaked and shivering, the children huddled near the roaring stove Elara had stoked upon their last trip for blankets. She moved among them, handing out rough towels. Martha sat on a low stool, her small hands red and stiff with cold. Elara knelt before her, gently chafing the tiny fingers between her own larger, work-roughened palms, trying to coax warmth and feeling back. The wind still howled, but the kitchen felt different, filled with the smell of wet wool, wood smoke, and shared exhaustion. Martha looked up, her eyes wide and dark in her pale face, the blue ribbon damp against her wrist. The chaos, the shared effort, the simple human warmth of Elara's hands on hers seemed to momentarily dissolve the careful walls the child kept. Martha's lips parted. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thin. Then softer, almost lost in the stove's crackle. "Thank you, Mama." The word hung, stark and impossible. Martha's eyes flew wide with horrified realization. She snatched her hands back as it burned, a choked gasp escaping her. Before Elara could react, could even draw a breath, Martha scrambled off the stool and fled the kitchen, her small footsteps pounding up the stairs into the shadowed silence above. Elara remained kneeling on the worn floorboards, the ghost of the child's cold hands still tingling on her palms, the forbidden word echoing in the sudden, hollow quiet of the room. Outside, the wind screamed down the chimney, but inside, the silence was deafening. "Mama," a wish uttered, a line crossed, a fragile new tension thrumming in the Montana dark. The word Mama hung like frost in the air long after Martha's footsteps faded upstairs. Elara remained kneeling on the kitchen floorboards, the ghost of the child's cold, small hands imprinted on her palms. The stove crackled, a jarring counterpoint to the silence that had swallowed the room whole. Outside, the wind still mourned, but inside, the quiet was thicker, charged with the weight of a wish uttered and instantly recoiled from. Elara slowly rose, her joints stiff from cold and kneeling, the familiar ache beneath her ribs, the hollow car for William, pulsed with new, sharp pang. She hadn't sought this, hadn't invited the word, yet its echo resonated in the emptiness she carried, a dangerous chord struck in the heart of this grieving house. Morning dawned brittle and cold, frost etching intricate, fragile patterns on the window panes, glittering like shattered hope under the weak sun. Martha was a ghost at breakfast. She slipped into her seat, eyes fixed on her untouched porridge bowl, shoulders hunched as if expecting a blow. She flinched when Elara placed a biscuit beside her plate, refusing to meet her gaze, the faded blue ribbon wound so tightly around her finger the tip turned white. The other children felt it too. Thomas shoveled food with grim efficiency, avoiding looking at either Martha or Elara. Sarah retreated further into her detachment, a faint frown line appearing between her brows. Emma and Claire exchanged wide-eyed, nervous glances. Only Ben seemed oblivious, chattering about the storm until Thomas nudged him sharply into silence. Silas ate, standing by the door, his gaze sweeping the tense tableau before vanishing back into the frosty morning without a word. His silence felt heavier than before, a wall reinforced. Elara threw herself into work. She scrubbed the already clean stovetop until the cast iron gleamed dully. She attacked the mending basket with fierce concentration, the rhythmic pull of the needle a mantra against the unease. She noticed Clara watching her again, the younger girl hovering near the pantry door. "Clara," Elara said softly, keeping her voice neutral, "the bread dough needs kneading. Could you fetch the flour sack?" The girl's eyes widened, but she nodded, scurrying to obey. Elara tipped the coarse flour into a large bowl, adding water and precious salt. "Hands in," she instructed gently. Clara hesitated, then plunged her small hands into the cool, sticky mass, a look of intense concentration on her face as she mimicked Elara's pushing and folding motions. It was a small thing, teaching a chore, but the shared focus, the quiet instruction, seemed to ease the air fraction. Ben sidled closer, watching, his earlier chatter subdued. "Can I poke it?" he whispered. Elara nodded, a faint smile touching her lips as he carefully prodded the yielding dough. Martha, clearing plates, kept her back resolutely turned. The fragile calm fractured mid-morning. Elara was in the yard, wrestling damp sheets onto the clothesline strung between two gnarled pines. The frost had melted, leaving the ground slick with mud. Ben, tasked with handing her the wooden pegs, danced excitedly near the edge of the porch steps. "Look, a bluebird," he cried, pointing skyward, his small boot catching on a loose plank. He pitched forward with a yelp, tumbling down the last 2 steps onto the hard, muddy ground. A sharp, ragged cry tore from him. Elara dropped the sheet, rushing to him. He lay curled, clutching his knee, tears streaming down his dirty face. Blood seeped through a tear in his trousers. "Sure, Ben," Elara murmured, kneeling beside him, her own heart pounding. She gently pried his hands away. The gash wasn't deep, but it was long and ugly, oozing blood and mud. "Let me see, sweetheart." She scooped him up, his small body trembling against hers, his face buried in her neck, hot tears soaking her collar. He whimpered, a broken, frightened sound. "Hurts? Mama hurt so bad." The word mama, spoken not in startled warmth but in primal, frightened need, hung in the cold air. Elara froze for a heartbeat, then tightened her hold, carrying him swiftly towards the kitchen door. As she crossed the threshold, she saw Silas. He stood just inside the barn doorway, having witnessed the fall. His face was unreadable, carved from stone, but his eyes, fixed on Ben clinging to Elara and sobbing into her shoulder, held a stark, raw vulnerability Elara hadn't seen before. It vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by his usual stoic mask. He turned abruptly and disappeared into the barn shadows. Inside, Elara settled Ben on the kitchen chair near the stove. "Emma, fetch the clean rags and the brown bottle from the high shelf," she instructed, her voice calm despite the tremor inside. "Clara, the water basin, please." The girls moved quickly, the crisis overriding the tension. Elara cleaned the wound with water, wincing as Ben cried out. The brown bottle held whiskey, for cleaning, not drinking. She poured a little onto a rag. "This will sting, Ben," she warned softly. "Be brave." He nodded, eyes squeezed shut, his small hand gripping her sleeve like a lifeline. She dabbed the wound. He gasped a sharp intake of breath, his fingers tightening convulsively. "Mama," he whimpered again, the word a plea against pain. Elara kept her touch gentle, her focus entirely on him, on stemming the blood, on offering the only comfort she could. She bound the wound with clean strips of cloth, tying it snugly. "There now, brave boy." She smoothed his hair back from his damp forehead. He leaned into her touch, his breathing hitching, the storm of tears subsiding into exhausted shudders. Later, while Ben dozed fitfully on a pallet near the stove, a rider came. Not old man Dobbs this time, but a lean, unsmiling man on a tired bay horse, carrying the mail pouch. He handed Elara a single letter, his eyes taking in her worn dress, the sleeping child, the quiet kitchen. "Mrs. Vance?" he asked, his tone implying he'd heard the name, and likely the speculation elsewhere. She nodded, taking the envelope. The handwriting was familiar, spidery and precise. Her sister-in-law, Judith, back in Ohio. The rider touched his hat brim. "Heard you was out here at the Reeds. Quite a handful, them youngsters, ain't they? Especially without their ma." His gaze lingered, probing. Silas Reed, the lucky man, Finn didn't help willing to stick. There was an undercurrent in his words, a judgment veiled as observation. Elara felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, the locket cold against her skin. "The children need feeding," she replied evenly, echoing Silas's words from her first day. The rider nodded, a slow, knowing tilt of his head, before turning his horse and riding back down the trail. Alone, Elara stared at the letter. Judith's words would be practical, laced with persistent, anxious hope for Elara's return. Come home, they would say. This isolation, this servitude, it's not fitting. We worry. She traced the handwriting, the ink blurring slightly. Home. The word conjured the empty cabin she fled, the silence broken only by the wind screaming down the chimney, the silence that had nearly swallowed her whole. Here, despite the tension, the grief, the judgment, there was life. Ben's weight against her shoulder, Clara's tentative hands in the dough, the fragile trust she hadn't sought but couldn't deny. She remembered William's fevered brow beneath her palm, the terrifying heat, the desperate prayers whispered into the suffocating dark, the terrible stillness that followed. The locket held a single, pale curl, her sunshine extinguished. The hollow place inside yawned, vast and cold. Could this fragile belonging, this tentative mending of a broken family, ever fill it? Or was it just another kind of ache? She didn't open the letter. She placed it on the high shelf beside the brown bottle, a weight she couldn't face yet. Turning back to the kitchen, she saw Silas. He stood near the dry sink, placing a small, round tin on the worn wood. He didn't look at her. "For the hands," he said, his voice gravelly. "Salve. Blisters." He'd seen her raw, red palms, the result of wielding the axe during the storm. It was the first thing he'd given her, the first acknowledgement beyond necessity. Before she could find words, he was gone, the back door closing softly behind him. Elara picked up the tin. The metal was cool, simple, unadorned. She unscrewed the lid. The scent of pine tar and beeswax rose, pungent and clean. She dipped a finger into the golden salve, its smoothness a stark contrast to the roughness of her skin, the roughness of this life. A small, unexpected warmth bloomed beneath her ribs, tentative and fragile as the frost patterns on the window. As she rubbed the salve into her stinging palms, a movement caught her eye. Martha stood in the doorway to the parlor, her small frame tense. She wasn't looking at Elara, but down at her own hands, clenched tightly in front of her. Slowly, deliberately, she untied the faded blue ribbon from her wrist. She held it out, a tiny splash of color against the drab wool of her dress, her knuckles white. Her eyes, when she finally lifted them to meet Elara's, were filled with a terrifying mix of fear, defiance, and a desperate, unspoken plea. She didn't speak. She just held out the ribbon, the symbol of a mother lost, an offering trembling in the quiet kitchen air. The question hung, unvoiced but deafening. Could this be yours? Before Elara could move, could breathe, the distant, rapid drumbeat of hoofbeats shattered the stillness, growing louder, faster, heading straight for the house. The rapid drumbeat of hoofbeats shattered the fragile silence. Tearing through the moment, Martha held out the faded blue ribbon. Elara's hand, still tingling with the salve's pine and beeswax scent, froze midair. Martha flinched violently, snatching the ribbon back and clutching to her chest, her eyes wide with terror, not at the approaching rider, but at the vulnerability she'd just exposed. She fled into parlor shadows as the hoofbeats skidded to a halt outside, scattering gravel against the porch steps. Elara moved instinctively. She stepped onto the porch, pulling the door mostly shut behind her, shielding the children inside. Two men sat astride lather horses, not neighbors. Dust coated their rough-spun clothes and the brims of their slouched hats. The lead rider, a man with a face like sun-cured leather and eyes like chipped flint, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice onto the hard-packed earth. His gaze swept over Elara, dismissive and cold. "Silas Reed about?" His voice was a rasp, unwelcoming. Before Elara could answer, Silas emerged from a barn, his stride deliberate, his face the familiar mask of granite. He positioned himself slightly in front of Elara, a subtle barrier. "Harlan," he acknowledged, his voice flat. "What brings you this far off your range?" The tension crackled like static before a storm. Harlan's thin lips stretched into a humorless smile. "Business, Reed. Unfinished business." He shifted in his saddle, his gaze flicking past Silas to Elara again, lingering with insolent appraisal. "Heard you got yourself help." The pause was heavy with implication. "Makes things tidier, I reckon, for the transition." Silas didn't move, but Elara felt the subtle tightening of his posture. "My land's not for sale, Harlan. Told you before. Times change, Reed." Harlan leaned forward, resting a forearm on his saddle horn. A man alone, struggling, with all the mouths to feed. His eyes deliberately took in the worn state of the porch, the peeling paint. Accidents happen out here. Fences break, cattle stray. Gets costly, especially for a man who can't keep a wife alive. The deliberate cruelty hung in the air, vicious and sharp. Elara sucked in a breath. The memory of Ben's cry, "Mama, hurts," flashing through her mind alongside a sudden, fierce understanding of Silas's isolation. Silas took a single step forward. The movement was quiet, but it carried the weight of a boulder shifting. "Get off my land, Harlan." The words were low, lethal. Harlan's smile vanished. "Or what? You gonna set your new woman on me?" He sneered, his gaze raking over Elara once more. "Looks more suited to scrubbing floors and handling trouble. Though I hear you Reeds ain't too particular 'bout who warms your bed now." A shadow filled the kitchen doorway behind Elara. Thomas, his face pale but set in lines of furious defiance, a heavy iron poker gripped white-knuckled in his hand. He didn't speak, just glared at Harlan, his father's stance mirrored in his young frame. Sarah peered behind him, her usual detachment replaced by a watchful intensity, her hand resting protectively on Clara's shoulder. Martha hovered further back, the ribbon a crumpled knot in her fist. Harlan chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. Whole brood coming to the lady's defense. "Touching." He straightened. "Final offer, Reed. Take it or things get messy. Real messy. Your choice. But choose fast." He nudged his horse, preparing to wheel away. Silas's voice stopped him, colder than the Montana wind. "She stays." The words weren't loud, but they carried absolute finality. He wasn't just addressing Harlan's insult. He was answering Ben's question, Martha's unspoken plea, the weight of Judith's unopened letter. He was claiming Elara's place, not as a replacement, but as a presence he would defend. And the land stays. "Next time you cross my line, Harlan, you best be ready." Harlan's flinty eyes narrowed. He spat again, the glob landing perilously close to Silas's boot. "Your funeral, Reed." He jerked his head at his companion, and they kicked their horses into a bone-jarring trot, disappearing down the trail in a cloud of dust and malice. Silence descended, thick and charged. Silas didn't look at Elara. He stared after the riders, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped his cheek. Thomas slowly lowered the poker, his knuckles still white, his breathing ragged. Sarah gently guided Clara back inside. Only Martha remained frozen in the doorway, her eyes fixed on Silas's rigid back, the ribbon forgotten in her shock. Elara found her voice, shaky but clear. "Who was that?" She needed to understand the threat shadowing this fragile refuge. Silas finally turned. The raw vulnerability she glimpsed when Ben was hurt was gone, buried deep again. But his eyes held a new exhaustion, a profound weariness. "Harlan Pike." He spat the name like poison. "Wants the north pasture. Springs there. Thinks grief makes a man weak. Easy pickings." He scrubbed a hand over his face, the gesture uncharacteristically revealing. "Annie, my Annie," she handled the ledgers, "knew the land deals. Pike tried to cheat her once, early on. She saw him off with a shotgun and words sharper than flint. A ghost of something, pride, anguish, flickered across his face. He waited till after. The unspoken words, after she died, hung heavy, been circling since. The pieces clicked. The isolation, the worn state of the ranch, Silas's burdened silence. It wasn't just grief. It was siege. Elara remembered Judith's letter, the plea to return to a safe, empty life. The hollow place inside her yawned, vast and cold. Safety was an illusion, here or anywhere. But here, there was life to fight for. "What does he mean to do?" she asked quietly. "Make trouble," Silas said grimly. "Cost me more than I can bear. Till I break or sell." He looked past her, towards a house, toward the children. His gaze settled on Martha, still hovering, pale and silent. A flicker of pain crossed his features. Need to check that north line again. After yesterday's patch job. He turned abruptly and strode towards the barn, his shoulders bowed under the weight of the threat and the memory of his wife. Elara watched him go, the scent of pine tar from the salve still on her hands. She turned back toward the house. Martha hadn't moved. Her eyes, huge and dark, met Elara's. The fear of Harlan was still there, but beneath it, something else. A dawning, terrible understanding of the danger shadowing their lives, and a flicker of the trust shattered when she called Elara Mama. Slowly, hesitantly, Martha uncurled her fist. The faded blue ribbon lay crumpled on her palm. She didn't offer it again. She just held it out, a silent question mark in the charged air. Elara took a step towards her. She didn't reach for the ribbon. She met the girl's frightened gaze. "He won't take you home, Martha," she said, her voice low but fierce. The promise felt like a vow, spoken as much to herself as to the child. It wasn't just about land. It was about this fragile belonging taking root. Martha's lower lip trembled. She looked down at the ribbon, then back at Elara. Before she could respond, a sharp cry cut through the afternoon, coming from the direction of the barn. Thomas's voice, laced with pain and shock. "Pa! Pa!" Elara's heart lurched. She and Martha both spun toward the sound. Silas burst in the barn entrance, his face ashen. He was half carrying, half dragging Thomas. The boy clutched his upper arm, blood welling thick and dark between his fingers, staining his sleeve crimson. His face was bone white, his eyes wide with shock and pain. "Shot!" Thomas gasped, his voice tight. From the ridge, didn't see, just heard the crack. Silas lowered Thomas gently onto the porch steps, ripping the boy's sleeve open with rough, urgent hands. The wound was a raw, angry puncture high on his arm. "Elara, clean rags. The whiskey, now." His voice was a ragged command, stripped bare of its usual gruffness, raw with fear. Elara moved, the world narrowing to the blood, Thomas's pale face, Silas's terror. She grabbed the whiskey bottle from the high shelf, knocking Judith's unopened letter to the floor unnoticed. As she rushed back, rags in hand, she saw Silas look up from his son's wound, his eyes scanning the pine-clad ridge line, bleak with fury colder than any Montana winter. The shot hadn't been an accident. Harlan Pike had made his first move. The fragile peace was shattered. The fight for their home, for this fragile family, had begun in blood, and Thomas's ragged breathing was the only sound in the sudden, terrible silence. Blood bloomed dark and swift across Thomas's torn sleeve, vivid against the weathered wood of the porch step. The boy's breath came in ragged gasps, his face bone white beneath the summer dust. Silas ripped the fabric wider, exposing the raw, puckered wound high on his son's arm. Elara's world narrowed to the crimson stain, the metallic tang sharp in the air, the frantic drumming of her own heart. She thrust the whiskey bottle and rags into Silas's waiting hands, her movements automatic, born of a deeper, older terror, the memory of William's fevered gasps, the helplessness that had choked her then, choking her now. "Hold him," Silas ordered, his voice stripped raw, the granite mask shattered by paternal fear. Elara dropped to her knees beside Thomas, bracing his trembling shoulders. His eyes, wide with shock and pain, locked onto hers. "Hurts bad," he gritted out. "I know, Thomas. I know," Elara murmured, her voice steady despite the tremor inside. She met his gaze, pouring every ounce of calm she didn't feel into her own. "Be brave now. Just a moment more." Silas poured whiskey onto a rag. Thomas flinched violently as the stinging liquid touched the wound, a choked cry escaping him. Elara held him firm, her hands anchoring him. "Look at me, Thomas. Look right here." His fingers dug into her arm, clinging as Silas worked swiftly, cleaning, probing for the bullet's path. Miraculously, it had passed clean through muscle, missing bone. Silas packed the wound with clean rags, binding it tight with strips torn from Elara's offered apron. "Pressure," he instructed Elara, guiding her hand to press firmly above the bandage. His own hand, large and calloused, briefly covered hers, a fleeting, desperate connection in the crisis. Inside, the other children were frozen statues of terror. Martha huddled near the cold hearth, the blue ribbon crushed forgotten in her fist. Sarah stood rigid, her detachment replaced by wide-eyed horror, one arm wrapped protectively around Clara, who buried her face in her sister's skirt. Emma clutched Ben, his small face crumpled in fear. The cozy smells of wood smoke and drying herbs were overwhelmed by the sharp scent of whiskey and blood. Silas straightened, his face grim as he scanned the pine-clad ridge. "Emma," he said, his voice cutting through the silence. "Bar the shutters. Sarah, bolt the back door. Clara, bend under the table. Now!" The orders, sharp and clear, snapped them into motion. Even Martha scrambled to help Emma drag a heavy shutter across a window. Silas retrieved his rifle from above the hearth, the action smooth, lethal. He met Elara's eyes across the room. "Pike meant this. Warning shot." His gaze flickered to Thomas, pale but conscious on the settee where they'd move him. "Won't be the last." The unspoken weight of his wife's absence pressed down Annie, who'd faced Pike with a shotgun and ledgers. Elara understood the depth of his burden now, the reason for his fortress of silence. As dusk bled into violet twilight, casting long, ominous shadows, hoofbeats sounded again, not a stealthy approach, but a group moving purposefully. Silas tensed, rifle ready, positioning himself as shuttered windows slit. Elara stood beside him, a cast-iron skillet gripped in her white-knuckled hand, a pitiful weapon, but defiance nonetheless. Martha crept closer to Elara, pressing against her skirts, a silent plea for shelter. Old man Dobbs's voice boomed from outside. "Silas, it's Dobbs. Got Sheriff Cobb with me and a few others. You all right in there?" Relief, sharp and dizzying, washed over Elara. Silas lowered his rifle a fraction, suspicion warring with cautious hope. He unbarred the door, opening a crack. Dobbs, the sheriff, a stern-faced man with a silver star, and 3 other ranchers stood in the yard, rifles held loosely but ready. Harlan Pike and his crony were nowhere in sight. "Heard a shot, Silas," Dobbs stated, his eyes scanning the house, lingering on Thomas lying pale on the settee, on Elara holding the skillet, on Martha pressed close. Then saw Pike ride in Helfer leather toward the pass. Figured it weren't social. Sheriff Cobb stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "Pike been causing trouble, Reed? Serious trouble?" He nodded towards Thomas's bandaged arm. Silas's voice was gravel. "Wants the north pasture. Springs. Threaten me. Threaten my..." He hesitated, the word family catching. "My children. My help." He gestured vaguely toward Elara. "Then this..." He indicated Thomas. Dobbs spat. "That snake. Been sniffing around other spreads too. Thinking grief makes a man easy pickings." He looked directly at Elara. "Saw how you handled yourself during that fence storm, ma'am. Saw the young uns looking to you." He turned back to Silas. "Ain't right what Pike did. Ain't Montana way." We're set to end a watch tonight. Silas, Radat and men. He shows his face again. He answers to the sheriff and the rest of us. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a shield forged by the harsh code of the frontier community. Harlan's shadow hadn't vanished, but it had been pushed back. After the men positioned themselves around the perimeter, the house settled into an exhausted quiet. Thomas slept fitfully, dosed with a few drops of whiskey for the pain. Sarah and Emma cleared away the bloody rags. Clara and Ben fell asleep near the stove, wrapped in a shared blanket. Silas banked the fire, his movements weary. Elara found Judith's letter on the floor, where she knocked it. She broke the seal by lamplight. The words were as expected. Come home, Elara. This harsh life, this servitude, it's beneath you. We worry. You belong with family. Family. The word echoed hollowly. She thought of the empty Ohio cabin Judith meant, the silence that was a living thing. She looked around the dim kitchen, at Thomas's pale face, at Martha watching her with huge, uncertain eyes, at Silas's broad back as he checked the door bolt. This raw, grieving, fiercely defended place, this was where life pulsed, however painfully. She fed the letter, unread beyond the first lines, into the stove's hungry flames. The paper curled, blackened, vanished. A decision made in ash. Martha approached silently. She stood before Elara, holding out the faded blue ribbon, smooth now, but still creased. Her eyes held none of the earlier terror, only a profound, trembling hope. For your hair? She whispered, her voice barely audible. So you stay? Elara's breath caught. She looked at the ribbon, a fragile symbol of a mother lost and a connection tentatively offered. She didn't take it to replace what was gone. She took it to honor what was being built. Slowly, she gathered her thick, dark braid, winding the ribbon around its base, tying it securely. The soft blue nestled against her hair, a quiet declaration. I'm staying, Martha, she said softly. Martha's lower lip trembled. Then a tremulous smile broke through, fragile as dawn. She didn't say the word again, but she leaned forward, resting her forehead against Elara's arm for a fleeting moment before darting away to sit near the sleeping Ben. Silas turned from the door. He'd witnessed the exchange. His gaze swept over Elara, taking the ribbon in her hair, the resolve in her stance. The sleeping children. He walked to the dry sink, pouring 2 tin cups of water. He handed one to Elara. Their fingers brushed. His eyes, faded denim blue, held hers in the lamplight. Not warmth, exactly, but profound, weary acceptance. A recognition. Long day, he said, his voice rough. Tomorrow needs mending. He gestured vaguely, encompassing the wounded son, the threatened land, the fragile household. You'll be here? Elara sipped the cool water. She touched the ribbon in her hair, then the cool brass of the locket beneath her blouse. One a promise to the future, one a testament to the past. Both part of her now. She met his gaze. I'll be here, she answered, the word simple, final. Outside, the Montana wind sighed around the eaves, carrying the chill of the high country and the scent of distant pines. Inside, the oil lamp guttered low, casting long, dancing shadows. Silas settled into the worn armchair near the stove, his rifle across his knees, a silent sentinel. Elara sat on the floor near the sleeping children, her back against the warm stones of the hearth. Martha crept closer, resting her head tentatively on Elara's knee. Emma shifted in her sleep, murmuring. Thomas's breathing evened out. The salve-tin Silas had given her sat on the shelf. Its pine and beeswax sent a subtle undertone. Healing was slow. Grief lingered in the corners. Danger still prowled the edges of their world. But in the quiet heart of the night, within the weathered walls of the rocking R, a family, forged in loss, defended in blood, and chosen in quiet acts of courage, held fast against the dark. The wind might scream down the chimney, but the embers in the stove glowed, steadfast, holding the promise of warmth for the dawn.